What's up, Man Fans? I'm your host, Josh Black, and this is the Man Fans Fantasy Football Podcast. Hit me up on Instagram and Twitter at ManFansFF and on Facebook at ManFansFootball. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's where you can check out our brand new video series, Draftkings Fantasy Locks. It's a short video designed to help you guys get started building your lineups, and I'll put a link to our channel in the description box below. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers over there on the YouTube, so hook me up. Go to our channel, subscribe, and click that notification bell. NFL Week 5 is here, and Man Fans know what time it is. It's time to get down to business with that Week 5 Draftkings Fantasy Preview. As always, I'll give you my top plays for Sunday's main slate. We'll break down every position using DraftKings pricing, Pro Football Focus statistics, and betting lines by Bovada. Let's start under center. I know a lot of people are going to be targeting one of these big four quarterbacks up top. Jackson, Mahomes, Prescott, and Watson are projected for about 50% of all the ownership this week. And yeah, for cash, these guys are probably going to be just fine. But there is some major blowout risk with a couple of these games. And if I had to choose, I'd play Lamar Jackson. But I don't have to choose. I'm sticking to the script. I'm going value plays at quarterback this week. So let's get this party started with Carolina Panthers quarterback Teddy Bridgewater. Carolina's at Atlanta this week and a 1-point dog. DK's got him priced at $5,900 and projected for 16.8 fantasy points. The Panthers signal caller is really starting to heat up. Last week against Arizona, he finished his QB4 in fantasy scoring, passing for 276 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 pick. Plus, he added 32 yards on the ground and a rushing touchdown. Carolina runs this dink and dunk offense, and that's got Teddy's average depth of target at only 6.9 yards. But I think that changes this week. Bridgewater faces off against an Atlanta defense that ranks 23rd against opposing quarterbacks. The Falcons are super thin in the secondary. Last week, they rolled into Lambeau Field down 3 of their defensive backs, and then they lost 2 more in that game. Atlanta allows the second most passing yards per game in the NFL, and they've surrendered a league-high 13 passing touchdowns. They've been the fantasy cheat code for opposing quarterbacks. In Week 1, Russell Wilson finished as QB2 in fantasy scoring. In Week 2, Dak Prescott finished as QB1. And last week, Aaron Rodgers finished as QB3. So giddy up, Teddy B. Here's an interesting side note. The Panthers' backup running back, Reggie Bonnafon, he sustained an ankle injury last week, and now he's on IR. That leaves only 2 running backs on the Panthers roster, and that should add to Teddy's rushing floor. I like Bridgewater for 300-plus passing yards, multiple touchdowns, and another 3 to 4 fantasy points on the ground. If you're playing cash games, you're playing Teddy Bridgewater. Washington football team quarterback Kyle Allen. He's at home against the Rams, and Washington is a 7.5-point dog. DraftKings has him priced at $4,100, and Pro Football Focus has him projected for 15.1 fantasy points. This guy, he was a late addition for me this week. Head coach Ron Rivera announced on Wednesday that a quarterback change was coming. Dwayne Haskins got benched, and he's rolling with Kyle Allen. Allen has plenty of experience running Ron Rivera's offense. He started 13 games for the Panthers last season and averaged 16 fantasy points per start. This week, he'll face off against a Rams defense that ranks 14th against opposing quarterbacks. Real talk, it's not a great matchup. LA allows 252 yards per game passing, and they're top 5 in the league with 12 sacks. But I just can't pass up on Kyle Allen at $4,100. Dude can sling it. In 2019, he went over 3,300 passing yards, threw for 17 touchdowns, and had an adjusted completion percentage of 73.3%. He adds a little something with his legs too, averaging over 5 yards per scramble and rushing for 2 touchdowns last season. This is a high floor, low ceiling kind of play, but it allows us to pay up at other positions, so I'm down to ride. I don't think Allen has the upside for GPP consideration, but he should be just fine for cash. You can lock him in. Other quarterbacks I like this week, New York Giants' Daniel Jones is on the road at Dallas, priced at $5,400, projected for 18.2 fantasy points, and I expect a lot of pass attempts from Danny Dimes in this one. The Giants are 8.5-point dogs, and the matchup against Dallas is super juicy. Las Vegas Raiders' Derek Carr, He's on the road at Kansas City, priced at 5,300 and projected for 15.4 fantasy points. And even though Las Vegas runs a slow-paced, run-first offense, I think the game script is going to require Carr to throw a ton in the second half. Moving on, let's dive into my top running back plays in Week 5. This is where I want to spend my money this week. My top 5 running back plays are all over 6K. And if you're looking for a top 5 lock, look no further than Dallas Cowboys running back Ezekiel Elliott. He's at home this week against the Giants, and the Cowboys are an 8.5 point favorite. Draftkings has him priced at 7,800 and projected for 22.3 fantasy points. This dude, he's as steady as they come. Zeke's currently sitting as RB4 in fantasy scoring, and I've been really impressed at his usage in the pass game. This week, Elliott's matched up against a Giants defense that ranks 17th against opposing running backs. They've actually been pretty stingy against the run, averaging 1.25 yards before contact and 3.6 yards per carry. But in their last 3 games, they've given up over 6 catches per game to opposing running backs, and that's good news for Zeke, because in his last 3 games, he's averaging over 6 catches and 10 fantasy points per game as a receiver. I like Elliott for upwards of 80 rushing yards, 6+ catches, and a touchdown. He may be the chalkiest running back on the slate, but if he finishes as RB1, you'll savor the flavor. Kansas City Chiefs running back Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He's at home against the Raiders, and the Chiefs are an 11.5 point favorite. DraftKings has him priced at 6,800 and projected for 18.1 fantasy points. It's been hit or miss for this guy so far. CEH is definitely a matchup-dependent back-end RB1. And this week, the matchup is juicy AF. He'll square off against a Raiders defense that allows the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs this season. The Raiders have allowed 5 yards per attempt, and they've surrendered a league-high 8 rushing touchdowns so far this season. And that's the department where Clyde has struggled. He's been held out of the end zone in 3 consecutive contests, but I like him to buck that trend this week. The stars are aligning for Kansas City's rookie. The Chiefs should be playing with a lead from start to finish, so the rushing volume's going to be there. Plus, the Raiders just can't tackle. They average nearly 4 yards after contact, and CEH is top 3 in avoided tackles. Not to mention, he's top 5 in red zone rushing attempts. Let's call it 100+ rushing yards, 3 or 4 catches, and a touchdown. It's not the sneakiest play on the slate, but this dude is the sole reason I'm fading Patrick Mahomes, and I think he exceeds 3 times cost per point, no problem. Las Vegas Raiders running back Josh Jacobs. The Raiders are at the Chiefs in an 11.5 point dog. Jacobs is priced at 6,300 and projected for 18.3 fantasy points. You guys remember Josh Jacobs, right? The number 1 running back in fantasy football after week 1? Dude's been MIA since. He also hasn't scored a touchdown since, but I think he bounces back in a major way this week. Jacobs draws a Kansas City defense that ranks 11th against opposing running backs, so it sounds like a bad matchup, but don't let those stats fool you. The Chiefs allow 161 rushing yards per game. That's bottom 5 in the NFL. And they've surrendered 5.3 yards per carry. That's second most in the league. He averaged over 100 yards rushing per game against them last season, and I like that trend to continue. I like him for 100+ rushing yards this week. Add another 3 or 4 catches, and that's 3 times cost per point. If he hits pay dirt, then we hit a home run. You can lock him in. Other running backs worth a look in Week 5, Carolina Panthers Mike Davis is on the road at Atlanta, priced at 6,400, projected for 13.6 fantasy points, and Davis has been a top 5 running back over the last 2 weeks. He's my favorite player to stack with Teddy Bridgewater. Houston Texans David Johnson at home against Jacksonville, priced at 5,200 on DraftKings, projected for 15.3 fantasy points, and this is a nice bounce back spot for the veteran. Jacksonville allows the 7th most rushing yards per game and the 6th most fantasy points per game to the position. Washington Redskins Antonio Gibson at home against the Rams, priced at 5,000, projected for 12.1 fantasy points, and this dude's been one of the few bright spots on this Washington offense. He scored a touchdown in 3 straight, and his passing game usage gives him a safe floor. Let's shift gears and talk about my Week 5 wide receivers. There's a ton of guys in play for me this week at wide receiver, but no one up top really tickles my fancy. I'm going full fade over 7K and starting at Kansas City wide receiver Tyreek Hill. He's at home against the Raiders, and the Chiefs are an 11.5 point favorite. Draftkings has him priced at 6,900 and projected for 17.8 fantasy points. It's been slow and steady for a guy who's widely regarded as the fastest player in the league. Tyreek has yet to eclipse 100 yards receiving in any game so far, but he scored a touchdown every week, and he hasn't scored less than 15 fantasy points in any game this season. This week, he draws a Raiders defense that ranks 11th against opposing wide receivers. And I know that sounds like a bad matchup, but I think that ranking has more to do with how terrible Las Vegas is against the run and less with how good they are against the pass. The Raiders secondary is playing without cornerback Damon Arnett, and they just don't have anybody who can cover Tyreek. Primary coverage out of the slot's going to come from LaMarcus Joyner, and he's given up catches at a 76% rate. Pro Football Focus has that matchup rated as a 51% advantage for Hill. That's the second biggest on the slate. I don't expect Hill to see double-digit targets, but I think he busts a couple big plays early and hits pay dirt for the 5th consecutive game. Tyreek Hill's a safe bet for top 5 production this week. Carolina Panthers wide receiver Robbie Anderson. Carolina's at Atlanta and a 1-point dog. Draftkings has him priced at 5,900 and Pro Football Focus has him projected for 13.9 fantasy points. Anderson's been a big surprise for fantasy owners. We all knew about his talent, but going into Carolina in the offseason came with some question marks as to his role in the offense. Well, those questions have been answered. He leads all Panthers wide receivers in targets, catches, and receiving yards. This week, Robbie's in play against an Atlanta defense that ranks 22nd against opposing wide receivers. They are beyond injured in the secondary. And last week, starting safety DeMonte Casey went down with a torn Achilles. The Panthers allow 353 yards per game receiving. That's second worst in the NFL. And they've surrendered 13 receiving touchdowns. That's the most in the NFL. Anderson lines up all across the formation, and he'll have an advantage everywhere he goes. Primary defender A.J. Terrell gives up catches at an 89% rate. I expect him to be busy this Sunday. Dude's a top 10 receiver in like every major statistical category. He ranks 9th in the league with 34 targets, 5th in receptions with 28, 7th in receiving yards with 378, and his 84% catch rate is top 15 in the NFL among qualified wide receivers. And this might be a sneaky play. Pro Football Focus only has him projected for 10% ownership. The combination of big playability, juicy matchup, and low ownership make Robbie Anderson my favorite GPP play at wide receiver this week. New York Giants wide receiver Darius Slayton. The Giants are at the Cowboys in an 8-point underdog. Slayton's priced at 4,800 on DraftKings and projected for 13.2 fantasy points. After a hot start in week 1, Slayton's been a non-factor, averaging a measly 7 fantasy points per game over the last 3 weeks. But this week, he gets that super juicy matchup against Dallas. They've allowed the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I'll save you the laundry list of guys who've wrecked them. Just know they've given up the second most passing touchdowns in the NFL. And over the last 3 weeks, they've allowed an opposing wide receiver to finish as wide receiver 1 in fantasy scoring every single week. This time, it's Slayton's turn to eat. Dude leads the Giants in routes run, and he holds a 16% target share. He may not finish as wide receiver 1, but at 4,800, he doesn't have to. We need 15 fantasy points to hit value, and I think he gets there on catches and yardage alone. Sprinkle in a touchdown, and that's the recipe for fantasy goodness. If you're looking for a cash game wide receiver, Darius Slayton's your guy. I mentioned earlier that I like a ton of wide receivers this week, so I've got 4 bonus plays for you. Houston Texans Will Fuller's at home against the Jacksonville Jaguars, priced at 6,600, projected for 13.4 fantasy points, and if you want to stack Deshaun Watson with a Texans pass catcher, Will Fuller's your guy. Los Angeles Rams Cooper Kupp is on the road at Washington, priced at 6,500, projected for 15.7 fantasy points, and he should be in for a big day against slot cornerback Jimmy Moreland. That's a 48% advantage for Kupp. New York Jets wide receiver Jamison Crowder at home against Arizona, priced at 5,800, projected for 12.4 fantasy points, and this game's in limbo right now, but if it pops off, I expect Crowder to go off. Fellow wide receiver Brashad Perryman is doubtful this week, and that just solidifies an already beastly role for Crowder and his 24% target share. Atlanta Falcons wide receiver Olamide Zaccheaus at home against Carolina, priced at a rock bottom $3,000 and projected for 7.7 fantasy points. With Julio Jones not expected to play, this dude should step into a major role. He'll be a popular salary saver come Sunday. Moving on. Let's dive into my top tight end plays this week. This is one of those weeks where I'm going to have to pay up for tight end production. The dumpster dive type value plays, they're just not doing it for me this week. My money's on Las Vegas Raiders tight end Darren Waller. Las Vegas is at Kansas City in an 11.5 point underdog. Waller's priced at $5,900 and projected for 13.9 fantasy points. We talk about this dude almost every week. Waller got back on track last time out against Buffalo, posting 9 catches for 88 yards. This week, he's up against a Kansas City defense that ranks 18th against opposing tight ends, so nothing too scary about the matchup. Waller currently leads all tight ends with 39 targets and 29 catches, due in large part to a leaky Raiders defense that's got them playing from behind more often than not. In both games against Kansas City last year, Waller led the Raiders in targets, catches, and receiving yards. I like history to repeat itself this week. And even though I'm high on Josh Jacobs, I think Vegas is right. The Raiders should be playing from behind in the second half, and it's going to be the Darren Waller show. This game has an astronomical 56-point total, so you're going to need some exposure. I like Waller for 8 to 10 catches, 100 plus receiving yards, and a touchdown. You can lock him in. Let's round out the Week 5 preview with my top plays at defense and special teams. COVID threw a wrench in my plan this week. I wanted to go all in on the Patriots defense, but that game got postponed until Monday. I know most of the ownership is going to fall on the Ravens, Rams, and Steelers, and if I had to choose, I'd go with Pittsburgh. But I have a hard time seeing any of these defenses paying off in a major way. So I'm punting the position and rolling with the Carolina Panthers defense. They're on the road at Atlanta in a 1-point dog. Draftkings has them priced at $2,400, and they're projected for 6 fantasy points. The Panthers are starting to play better defense. They've held their last 2 opponents under 21 points and forced 5 takeaways in those 2 games. Carolina's run defense has been improving from a yards per game perspective, and they're top 10 in the NFL in terms of yards per game allowed passing. This week, they match up against a Falcons offense that ranks 5th against opposing defenses. But we saw how bad they looked in the second half last week without Julio Jones, and he's expected to miss this game too. I like the Panthers offense to put up points and the Panthers defense resting on the sideline. If Atlanta becomes one-dimensional in the second half, that plays to the Panthers' strong suit. Giddy up, Carolina. And that's a wrap on the Week 5 DraftKings Fantasy Preview. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at ManFansFF, over on the YouTube at ManFans Fantasy Football Podcast. If you love this show, smash the like button, subscribe to the podcast, and leave a review. Good luck this week. I hope you guys see some green screens, and I'll catch you on the flip side.